Hello everyone, welcome to Coffee Cup Enlightenment. Today's video is going to be on the topic of the real you. And a couple months ago, a friend and I were playing around just to draw a model of, we both had to sort of spend a few minutes just quickly drawing a model of, I guess you can call it the human condition. And this one I drew up, it only took like about 60 seconds, so it's not really much thought's gone into it. It's just a basic, which is basically, I just drew this one up. I don't know if you can see it on the video. Hang on. There it is. So I just drew that up now, which is just an enlargement of this. And yeah, it doesn't really look. If probably a little bit more thought went into it, it could have been a little bit more corresponding and matching. But basically, it's just drawn up to give a basic idea of. There's some things in this that's generally not commonly spoken about. When it comes to self-inquiry and self-awareness, there's a lot of talk about the negative aspects of the conceptual self. And you know the effects that they have on your experience of life and quality of life, and but not much is really talked about the positive aspects. I've sort of spoken about it a little bit in videos, previous videos, but this one's designed to more focus on the both sides of the polarities of content, which becomes identified with not just the negative but also the positive, and how they both play into each other and keep you identified. And it all starts with, I do have a few notes here. The real you. So pretty much the real you is contentless awareness, and pretty much proof, evidence of this, that's who we are, is when we come into the world as a baby, there is no content yet identified with. We're like a clean slate. So that becomes point number one of evidence that proves that we are contentless awareness. Even as a baby, there's a life force and an essence, which is which gives life to that expression, and that is the contentless awareness. It doesn't consist of any content. It is the witness of content. And that's our essential nature. Another proof of that who we are is contentless awareness. Even when content does come into our lives at an early age, like at the age of 1 or 2 years old, when concepts start to become identified with. Say for example, the 15-year-old, the structure, I've labelled it here, the body of self. So this represents the positive and negative aspects of the image, the conceptual image that's been constructed. So it all starts with one concept, which is me, which is an individual, and that becomes the first concept, and then that gives rise to it really starts snowballing the process after that. There's many other processes that follow. There's a judgment, a judger of that individual self sort of arises, and it's all fueled by first the suggestion of me is presented to the baby, and then it's and the whole process of identification happens in the first place is because we come into this world as contentless awareness, but you don't know yourself as that yet. So it's almost the destiny and the inevitableness for everybody that comes into this world to go through this process of identification with content. And then as we get into our adult years, there can be an opportunity where content starts to show its effects and its dysfunction and its limitations. And then this video, which is the topic of self-inquiry, can be used to bring awareness to content and recognize that we are beyond content, that we are the witness to content, the perceiver, the seer of content, and that essence, this seer, this perceiver, this witness, it doesn't consist of any content. The analogy can be used like this: where the sky or space, which is air, and everything else that exists in that air is content. But without the air and the space, content could not exist. And so prior to all content is the awareness that you are. So it's pretty much necessary for everyone to go through this. As sort of Jesus said, you lose yourself and then you find yourself and then you know yourself more than ever before. And that's the game of life, and what everyone's going through. And it's natural that eventually content that keeps exposing itself in our field of consciousness, and eventually our consciousness, there's a discernment and a distinction process that occurs naturally, and all of a sudden that content is looked at, and then it's realized that's not me. And then the importance which our awareness and consciousness gave to that content, all of a sudden it drops away, and the apparent life that appeared to be coming from that content, it also drops away, and it's just recognized as content, and it's no longer registered in the field of consciousness anymore. It's just a passing thought that goes past. With all these different contents here, not everyone has and as I said, these I've only just given quick 3 examples of each one, and I'm going to go into them soon. But not everyone has these examples. There's probably several dozen examples if you can break it up into categories where each one of these could have. So there could be up to 100 different to maybe 200 different categories all up. Where all the positives and negatives play into each other. And the disidentification process with content occurs pretty much when you go for the full spectrum of positive and negative, and you see both of them aren't new. And then that whole charade of the positive and negative playing into themselves, which is fueled by our identification, it drops away. And they no longer become part of our sense of self anymore. And it's pretty much the goal and purpose that all content inevitably becomes exposed. And that is what you could say is the definition of enlightenment. It's when there's no more identification with content, not because you're trying to do something or achieve something, is because you realize that content is just content. It's just an idea. And it's so contradictory, and it's limiting, and not because you want to be unlimited, it's just because it's just the nature of content. It's just eventually it starts to reveal itself and expose itself that it's not really as important as it appeared to be at first. Especially when you're young, many content mesmerizes us into identification with it, and we very quickly go through the process. And that was the second point, which is the 15-year-old content based self, compared to, like, say, a 45-year-old content-based self. The 45-year-old content-based self may look at the 15-year-old content-based self that it used to have and say, I'm much more mature and developed now, but ultimately it's still just content. And there's a lot of content that got dissolved in the 15-year-old sense of self, and that's why there's no more certain responses to certain situations anymore, such as crying. Now in the 45-year-old self there's laughter, and that's evidence as well that laughter is much more in tune to the truth of who we are, because it's only all disturbances ultimately come from this body of self. It's never us that's ever disturbed. No one's ever been depressed in 1 million years of history. No one's ever been angry in 1 million years of history. The depression is just a reflection of this body of self, which is fueled and given life to an apparent reality of life by our identification. The only thing that exists as life, which is us, which is contentless awareness, and it is what it focuses on that molds and gives reality, a sense of reality, a pseudo reality. But the only thing that's true and ever constant in this world is us. The real us, not the content-based us. And that brings up to the next point, is that the real us is not subject to change, because it, it doesn't consist of any content. Only content can shift and change. So it's the nature of when we undergo this process of identification with content, that we believe, because we believe us to be this content, and content is subject to change and development, that we are developing, and that's not true. The true you, the true us, is not subject to any development. It's contentless in nature, and only content can develop, and it doesn't need development, because it's everything and everything anyway. It's even beyond. It's beyond the concept of development, and it's totally not necessary. And one of the other proofs also that we are contentless awareness is when you look into the world of the animal kingdom. They don't have this conceptual realm like humans do. They don't have the identification process like humans do. And you can say that they're already like enlightened, and that's why animals, they're already running to the hills 5 minutes before a tsunami comes. The animals in the zoos are crying out several minutes before an earthquake occurs, and that's because they're in touch. It's a natural, normal state of connectedness, which humans have come out of that connectedness, because their focus is on this content-based self, and all the natural abilities, you can say, or aspects of who we are somewhat, they're still with us, they're still there in the background, but they're just not brought to life, because all our attention is on content. And that's all, as I think I just said before, enlightenment is about, is no longer following content. That's it. And because you can see content is not important, and it can never be who you are. It becomes very apparent and self-evident. It doesn't need any belief system to it. Eventually, content, if you look back on your life and see the content that used to make up this body of self, it's no longer there anymore. It's been replaced and updated to version 2.0 and version, we've probably undergone possibly 1,000 different changes up until 40 years old. So there's about 1,000 different versions, and there's still some of those versions of the basic fabric structure, but all the versions consist of content. So that's the basic principle of enlightenment, is to cease identification with all content, because you can see content is not who you are. And why would you want to identify and turn your identity into something that you're not? And eventually the natural process of identification with content will always create a sense of dissatisfaction. Even though I've got the positive and negative aspects here, even the positive, even if you, like in today's modern psychology, which has probably been going on for 100 years or probably even longer, I don't know, but this is also the positive side of the conceptual self, and the negative side. It's called the positive self-esteem in the psychology world, and the negative self-esteem. But the esteem is a content-based conceptual self, and it's not who you are. So even if you are very successful at learning modern psychology, and you learn and you practice daily affirmations, and you maybe write down all the negative content based on self, and bringing awareness to this. This is also true self-inquiry, where you can put the negative list of content-based conceptual self on a list, and see that that's not you, and then a discernment and a distinction and a contrast starts to develop when you look at these concepts. But also this same process, and this is the part of the video that's not really talked about much by much people, is that also the positive aspects of the conceptual self also need to be put under the microscope and see that they are not you. Because this, you can become very good at self-affirmations and using positive psychology. There's nothing wrong with it. You can live a pretty reasonable life for decades using this method, or maybe your entire life. But it requires a continual state of effort, and even, not mentioning any names, but people who are into self-development, I've heard them even say this, and they say you just learn to love the effort. You know, it's a constant and never-ending, effort, and you just learn to love it. And that's just it's kind of a stage one on how we can live a little bit more of a positive or a bit more of a higher quality life. But what I'm talking about in this video goes beyond all of that. It's putting even the positive conceptual self under the microscope, and recognizing that that too is content, just as equal as the negative conceptual self. Both are content, and both are false, and both are not who we are. And then it requires no more effort anymore, and there's no more struggle, because your identity now rests as this contentless awareness, and that's where your true home is felt, when you return back to the recognition of that you already were. So there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to develop, there's nothing to fix, because nothing can, only content it can be broken and repaired and healed. And that I just want to see if I've missed any point before I go on to describing this thing here. So I've gone over positive and negative self-esteem. Yeah, not everyone has this particular content, so gone over that. The goal, what's the goal and purpose of content then? The reason, the goal and purpose of content is for us to become identified with it until we're not anymore. So as said before, everyone's got different, depending on where you're at in life, and maybe it could be said previous lifetimes where your awareness has come up to the point, then you only come into this world and correspond and resonate and identify with particular aspects of content, and this makes the variance of people, but it's not even the true variance of people. It's the variance of the conceptual selves. In our true nature, we're all universal and one. Universal consciousness, it's been described as. It's it's the one awareness behind the variance of content-based selves out there. That's where we all meet together in true connectedness and oneness. And it's always there already, because as soon as there's many times throughout our day, most of us already is we're not identified when we're relaxed and in a state of ease. Technically, you can say that's enlightenment. That's true love. When you're just with someone, when there's no thinking about who that person is, who you think you are, and there's no corresponding, which I'll go into the second part here, the doer of self. There's none of these plays going on. There's no identification with the body of self or the doer of self. And there's just a relaxed state of ease, a nothingness going on in the background. Then that's enlightenment. So we're technically experiencing enlightenment every day, and then our enlightenmentness goes and focuses on content, and then it temporarily takes us over. But to the greater extent, pretty much everybody has a background of identification in the background. I've explained it in a video before, where a couple years ago I awoken at 6 AM in the morning, and all the content disappeared from a dream. It was a visionless, audioless dream, and it was so gobsmacking that it was like 100,000 kilos was lifted in an instant, and all the content was exposed, and all the monkey mind just went quiet for 2 days. And that night, while I was in this body of warm water of complete neutrality and silence in the mind, and oneness feeling, which is all natural states, that night when I went outside, the air was actually glowing orange, and so it was who knows what. So this is sort of like proof for me that who knows what identification must be in me right now, that's affecting everyone really. It's in the background that our awareness has not seen. There's still a play of this body of self, the doer of self, that seems very important still, and this is blocking much more levels of enlightenment. And then, as the story happened a couple of years ago, after the next day, sorry, it wasn't 2 days, it was 1 day, the next day, So after 24 hours, around or whatever it was, lunchtime the next day, this body of self returned and its importance, and the doer of self returned as well, and it come gradually over a few hours at lunchtime the next day. So 6 a.m. this incident happened, and then the next day at lunchtime, and I could feel like a diver's helmet slowly being returned over the next 3-4 hours, and then by say 8 p.m. that night, I am how I am now, and it's become normal. So I'm wearing this diver's helmet, and this is what I believe everyone is actually wearing. We're wearing this diver's helmet of content, because there's still lots of things of these content that seem very, very important to us, to the consciousness, and it hasn't been brought into the field of discernment, distinction, and contrast. And that's where the process of disidentification occurs. There's, you got content, and then we witness content, and then we can feel ourselves as this, and we can see that that's just content, and all of a sudden it's just the charge to it disappears, and this thing that used to be so long our identity for so many years, all of a sudden it's not anymore. And that's why you can say people change. That's not true at all. We don't change. It's just the content that was deemed and seen as so important by the consciousness at the time was eventually exposed, and now it's not there anymore. But the essence of who we are is changeless. All that's happened is that particular content is no longer there anymore, and it can be the process for some people. As they get older, they add more and more content, and madness prevails. You can say more of the dysfunction of content prevails even more. I might just pause it for a bit. Okay, so now I want to talk about. I'm hoping people can see this, but I'll go over it in in audio anyway. But so yeah, the entire this content-based body of self is given life to from identification, and it's given it's identified with by our contentless awareness. And this can then birth a successful positive self, a happy positive self, a prideful positive self, and then on the negative aspects, a suicidal conceptual self, a depressed conceptual self, and an angry conceptual self. And so it becomes evident that you only just have to look into your own life to see that this is just a roller coaster in everyone's life, where it's the happy self, the sad self, the angry self, and whatever. Some, as I said, not everyone has these particular content-based, some of these content examples, but it's just the reason why it appears like a roller coaster is, and it continues to play its charades and keep appearing in our perception, is because it hasn't been recognised yet as content. That both the positive and the negative are both aspects of the same coin. They're both content, and then it goes into it sort of once you have the body of self, which represents the self-image, which is undergoing constant changes and versions from 15-year-old to the 45-year-old, etc. It develops a sort of like a you can almost describe it like as I don't really know the words of the antagonist and the one that helps and one that attacks, or my vocabulary doesn't. I couldn't think of any words of. But basically, it's like there's like a doer of self that it beats itself up. So who it's beating up. It's not us, because who we are is contentless awareness, which is watching the self beater upper. And who it's beating the body itself up, which is itself. So it seems bad. Why would it do that? But this is what's necessary for our awareness to come through and recognize in this distinction, discernment, contrast process that this isn't us. That this self beater upper is beating itself up. And if you just sit back and be quiet and watch it doing it, it will dissolve. The only reason the self beater upper exists is because you believe you're the body of self, and you believe also you're the beater upper, and then you say I am beating up myself. Both are false. The self it is beating up is a conceptual self based on content, and this doer of self is just the response of content, and it only arises because consciousness is fueling it through its identification. It's like it's a movie. It's a mirror perfect reflection coming back at us, and it corresponds perfectly to the awareness that wants to recognize itself, that's needing to recognize itself. I've described it in other videos. It's almost like a pie of who this contentless awareness is, and there's certain pieces of the pie that need to be realized, and each pie that's missing will reflect itself as one of these contents, and that content is it's not personal. It's only just coming into your life to say, look at me as just content, and then you'll get that pie of awareness. So that's the innocent process of all this content charade. It's only there designed as a natural process that brings you out of disidentification with content. And when that occurs, that's you realize that you already are enlightened, and there was nothing to achieve and nothing to do, and that you're already perfect. And even to use that word perfect comes from the content-based realm, so it's really a dirty word. It's not even really necessary. It's beyond perfection. How can you call contentless vastness perfect? It doesn't really make sense to call it that. Just try to imagine yourself as infinite space. Why would you call infinite space perfect? The other attributes of who we are, which is infinity and eternity. Infinity is because content, it's got all these polarities and limitation. But when you don't consist of any content, you're unlimited. And that's our natural state, unlimitedness. And that's why probably when I saw this orange illuminating air, there's unlimitedness. You know, I saw that as like an unlimitedness. And I also did see it as that nature outside was a little bit more reflective of, you know, if you want to call it God or consciousness or whatever. Probably be a bit more easier seen outside than inside. I could still see a little bit more 3D-ness to objects inside the house when I went back in the house. Once this sort of recognition came in of these, my visual senses were being expanded. Or not really expanded, were becoming revealed. And not obscured anymore. But you know, but it did seem more apparent that the outdoors seemed a bit more conducive to seeing true reality than indoors. And so the doer of self, it wants to fix itself. So these are important things because it seems, well, what more better thing and noble thing to do to want to fix yourself. But the self it's fixing, which is damaged, is the conceptual self. And the one that's trying to fix the conceptual self is the conceptual self. So the fixer of the self, the fixer self is actually fixing itself. So again, if you sit back quietly, don't do nothing and just watch the fixer self fixing itself, and then see how strange and silly that is, until it becomes apparent, that strange and silliness, and then that will become the distinction, discernment and contrast, which would create this identification there. Again, the healing self, I wrote this in like 60 seconds. It's pretty much the same as the fixer self. Validation self, I don't even know the meaning of that myself. I guess it somewhat ties into positive aspects of the self. The self beat up self we've gone through. The denying self, that was just a quick thing. And the blame self, so which is somewhat on the victim realm of who you think you are. So again, you can spend a lifetime in this victim conceptual self, but that's not us. And the one that is the body of victim, which is based the body of self, That's not us. So the victim self or the blame self, which is complaining about itself, both of them are not us. The body of self, we're not content, so we can never be a broken aspect. Therefore, we don't need repairing, and therefore there doesn't need to be one that complains either, because we don't consist of content anyway. So there cannot be a blamer or a denying self or whatever, or a victim self. This is only just an innocent mirror, perfect reflection expression that derives out of this identification with content. If you didn't identify with no more content, what will be left is the self-recognition that you are contentless awareness. But the only way we can discover this, and this is probably the last point before the end of the video, is we can use all this content deliberately. That's what the self-inquiry process is, and that's what I mostly talk about in these videos. In positive psychology, we learn to try to get away and do whatever, fight against the negative and try to build the positive, but you're just keeping the same coin. It's just another side of the same coin, and it'll keep you stuck in identification with content forever. There's no end to it, and always, even the positive aspect there'll be a continual sense of dissatisfaction, and eventually that dissatisfaction, and really it's not really you that's dissatisfied. It's a mirror. It's projected. It's the satisfied self is the body of self. So that will always, as long as you're being a conceptual self, you'll always experience this dissatisfied self, and you'd think it's you, but it's not. So eventually, all content has a disturbance energy to it. It actually doesn't want you to identify with it. It's always actually trying to push you away, because it's so unnatural and uncomfortable to identify with content. It creates so much. Whenever you push yourself into it, not you push, unconsciously you identify with content, it's going to create a disturbance effect and sensation, but it's not us being disturbed. We've never once been disturbed in our whole life, ever. It's never occurred. We are the witness of the disturbed self, which all arrive from one idea of me. That's the pinnacle. That's the top of the pyramid of that, which makes the continual complexity and never-ending complexity of the body of self develop even more complexity. And people spend lifetimes trying to figure out a partner. I can't figure this, but you're not meant to figure it out, because even if you did figure it out, eventually that content will change, and then you need to develop with that and try to figure it out more. And it's just a mad process, and that's why eventually couples, they either divorce or they eventually realise that, it may eventually bring them to realisation that that's not who they are, and there's nothing to figure out. It's just an expression of the current state of identification with content, and it's not personal. And that's true love. When you recognise that in another, that no one else. First, if you recognise that this is not you, then you can also apply that neutral, loving, seeing eyes to another, and realise that all of this is not another person either. And as Eckhart Tolle once sort of described, there's like 4 conceptual identities in a relationship. There's who you think you are. There's who you think you are, who you think the other person is, who the other person thinks you are, and who they think they are. And they're all interacting, and it's mad. And it's not genuine relationship. Genuine relationship is when you look at another as the definition of true love is the recognition of oneself in another, and that oneself is contentless awareness. So if you expand on that definition, which was in the movie The Wedding Crashers, and many other times this quote's sort of been, and many versions of it have been called, described as the definition of love is love is the recognition of the contentless awareness. what's the definition now? Sorry. Love is the recognition of oneself in another. So love is the recognition of the content, the awareness that we are, is also the contentless awareness in another. And that's where the two contentless awareness meet. Thank you.